Should you stay in shelters on the Appalachian Trail? Are shelters these cozy, dry places to get out of the elements? Or are they a breeding ground for mice? Are they a central location to catch norovirus? We're going to talk about all that stuff today, and hopefully by the end of this video, you are going to know a little bit more about staying in shelters along the Appalachian Trail. What's going on, everybody? My name is Kyle O'Grady. I'm a thru-hiker. I'm a peak bagger. I'm just a big hiking nerd, to be honest with you. And if you're a hiking nerd yourself or an aspiring thru-hiker, I encourage you to smash that subscribe button, maybe even smash that like button. And if you're not one of those things, then why the hell are you watching this video? Get out of here. In November of 2018, I started a podcast called Trail Tales. It's a backpacking, thru-hiking related podcast, and one of the questions that I've been asked quite a bit by people who are looking to thru-hike the Appalachian Trail is if they should stay in shelters or not. Now, the truth is, I'm just going to spoil it all right now. It just depends. It's highly personal, and the point of this video isn't to give like an objective answer to the question of whether or not you should stay in shelters. The point of this video is going to be just to lay out the pros, to lay out the cons, and let you make up your mind for yourself. Make sure you watch all the way to the end of the video, because once we go through the pros and the cons, I'm going to give my personal opinion on staying in shelters and talk about what I did during my thru-hike of the Appalachian Trail. To decide whether or not we start with the pros or the cons, we're going to flip this guitar pick. So if we get, I guess we'll call this heads, the side with the writing on it, then we're going to start with the pros, and if we get the other side, then we're going to start with the cons. Woo! All right, it looks like we're going to start with the pros. All right, so the first good thing about staying in shelters on the Appalachian Trail, the first pro, and honestly the biggest pro in my opinion, you're going to stay dry in shelters. It does not matter how shitty the weather is. It does not matter how fucking bad it's pissing outside. You're gonna stay dry with those 3 or 4 walls around you. Now, some people out there have absolutely nailed down setting up their tent or their hammock in the rain. And if that's the case, then they might not see this as a reason to ever stay in a shelter. But for most people, I feel like, or maybe I just suck at doing this stuff, but I don't know, I feel like most people have a hard time with that, or it's at least kind of a pain in the ass. So the idea of just rolling up to a shelter, literally just ducking under the roof and then taking out your sleeping bag, is very, very appealing. This is why you're gonna find that shelters usually will fill up a lot quicker and a lot more frequently when the weather is shitty, when it's raining outside. It's like you could either be confined to the small amount of room that you have in your tent, or the burrito sized room that you have in your hammock where you literally can't even walk around, or you could stay in the shelter and I mean, you're still not going to have a ton of room depending on what shelter you're in. Some are actually pretty big, but often they're not super big. But you're not going to be as confined is what I'm getting at here if you're in there for a long time. So the second pro of staying in shelters along the Appalachian Trail is that you're just going to have way more opportunities to socialize with other hikers. Now, I get that some people don't like to socialize, and that's why they're backpacking, you know, like going into the woods to like get away from people. Like, I totally get that. But for a lot of people on the Appalachian Trail, they want that social experience. The shelters are a rallying point. They're a point for everybody to kind of meet up. So if you're looking to make friends on the trail, you should definitely consider staying in shelters. And another thing is too, when it's raining and you're staying in your tent or your hammock, you're probably just gonna be kind of stuck on your own in your little setup, right? But if you're in the shelter, there's probably gonna be other people there. So even though it's raining, you can still have that social interaction. So this third pro of staying in shelters on the Appalachian Trail is for all my lazy hiker friends. Where you at? Let's be real. The last thing that you wanna do at the end of a really hard, long, and wet hiking day is set up your tent or your hammock. If you can skip any step in the post-hike camping process of setting up all your shit, you're probably gonna wanna do that. Staying in shelters means one less thing to do at camp, and it gives you a little bit more time to bullshit with your other hiking friends around the campfire. So this last pro of staying in shelters on the Appalachian Trail that I'm gonna go over is that, especially if you're a beginner hiker and you're not used to sleeping in the woods, it might just be more comfortable to sleep around other people. Now, I know there's some like macho hardo hiker out there that's like, psh, you guys are a bunch of pussies. You can't even sleep by yourself in the woods. Like, screw you.
I'm so tough.
If that's you, then obviously this doesn't apply to you. But the truth is, I feel like most people, at least when they start out, are a little bit uncomfortable sleeping away from other people in the woods. And for a lot of people, this can be kind of detrimental on a thru hike because you're losing sleep. Your body's not recovering like it needs to be if you're going to be hiking all these miles. And so sleeping in a shelter might give you a little bit of peace of mind. It might help you sleep a little bit better. Now, those are some of the pros of sleeping in shelters, some of the good things. But let's be real, it's not all fun and games out there. There's not just good things about sleeping in shelters. Believe it or not, there's actually quite a few cons of sleeping in shelters on the Appalachian Trail, and that's what we're going to go through right now. Con number one is people snore. There's nothing worse than getting all your stuff set up in a shelter, having some good conversations with the other folks staying with you, and then finally passing out only to wake up to the sound of someone snoring. Now, I'm not a particularly light sleeper, but if there's somebody next to me snoring, there's no way in hell that I'm gonna get any freaking sleep that night. Now, I'd like to think that most people who snore would know that and they'd be courteous enough to maybe set up their tent a little bit away from everybody else. But the fact of the matter is, those shelters are open to anybody, whether they're super fucking loud or not. And so you do have to kind of anticipate that and take that risk when you stay in a shelter. So the second con of staying in shelters on the Appalachian Trail is that you might see a mouse. And I'm not talking about the fun computer type of mouse. Am I the only person that thinks these are fun? I mean, I am a software developer, so I deal with these things quite a bit. Now, the rate at which a shelter is infested with mice is gonna depend on the shelter. It's gonna depend on how new it is. It's gonna It's going to depend on how long the shelter has been built. It's going to depend on how well the people that have stayed there before have cleaned up after themselves. But as a general rule, you should expect mice to be in all shelters. Again, they're not going to actually be in all shelters, but they are going to be in them frequently enough that you're definitely going to see them if you spend any time in shelters on the Appalachian Trail whatsoever. Now, maybe it's just because I'm kind of a dirtbag, but the mice never really bothered me too much. I mean, I don't like the idea of a freaking mouse like running over my head in the middle of the night, but like, I'm not one of these people that's like so disgusted by mice that I'm just gonna not stay in a shelter at all purely because of that.
Welcome to the Appalachian Trail shelters.
There was one time when I was in Maine at the end of my thru hike and I got woken up by a mouse. There was a bag of clothes that was hung relatively close to my face, kind of in front of me. And when I woke up, I could kind of see the mouse like scurrying around this bag. And I was like completely exhausted. It was probably 2 a.m, so I did not have time or energy to deal with this bullshit. So I grabbed my smart water bottle, which was sitting next to me, and I just freaking knocked that thing right off the bag. It flew out of the shelter, and then I went back to sleep. So this next con of staying in shelters on the Appalachian Trail is that they are kind of dirty and they can be kind of a breeding ground for norovirus. Now, if you're prepping for the Appalachian Trail, you've probably heard some pretty bad horror stories about norovirus. You might have even heard people say that the number one way to avoid noro is to just stay out of shelters on the trail. I did not get noro. I'm also not like a doctor, like I'm not a medical expert when it comes to like the transmission of different viruses and illnesses like this. However, it is my understanding that yes, shelters are a pretty significant place that people come down with noro from. One thing to keep in mind though is that shelters aren't the only place where noro spreads. So if you're like really that paranoid about it that you're gonna not stay in shelters purely because of noro, you might want to also avoid like hostels and hotels and towns that are along the trail and just like any interaction with other hikers. I mean, I'm kind of exaggerating there, but my point is just like, I wouldn't not stay in shelters just because of noro, because you're probably going to be exposed to it in other places as well. So I don't know. That's just something to keep in mind. So the last con of staying in shelters on the Appalachian Trail is that sometimes, not terribly often, but sometimes people will come in late to camp. Like you'll already be asleep. It'll be like, I don't know, like 10 or 11 o'clock or even later sometimes. And someone will all of a sudden wake you up with their headlamp as they come in. Maybe they were doing some night hiking and they want to set up in the shelter. It's just one of the cons that comes with staying in shelters. And if you're a really light sleeper and you can't stand being woken up at all during the middle of the night, or if any sort of light flash is going to wake you up, the flash of someone's headlamp, then yeah, you might want to avoid shelters. So those are the pros and cons of staying in shelters on the Appalachian Trail. Now that we've gotten those out of the way, I do kind of want to just go over what my personal opinion is and what my experience was staying in shelters on the AT. If the weather cooperated, I was pretty much always going to stay in my hammock. That being said, if I had been rained on like all day, or if like it was pouring rain when I rolled into the shelter, yeah, I would usually take a spot in that shelter and I would usually stay there, and I would honestly be pretty stoked about it. The rain has continued all day today, and we're hearing word that the trail north of where we're staying tonight is impassable because of flooding. So it was a lot easier to dry out that way, and honestly, when it was raining, I was usually not in the best mood, and being able to kind of interact with other hikers and be social was a great way to kind of flip that. And so that's kind of my take on staying in shelters. That was my experience. If you're preparing for the Appalachian Trail, just kind of keep these things in mind, but you're going to be best off just kind of feeling it out for yourself once you actually get out there. If you thought this was helpful, definitely leave a comment below and let me know. If you're a thru hiker of the Appalachian Trail yourself, I'd love to hear what you did on your thru hike, whether or not you stayed in shelters or under what conditions you did. And definitely if you have any funny or interesting stories related to staying in shelters on the AT, I'd love to hear those as well. So start typing, people. You should definitely smash that subscribe button. You should also smash that like button. And don't forget to pack out your pee and your poop. Have a good